Oh hell internet, I have spruced up a little bit for this last video on the core doctrines of Master Mo. I've also written something down which I originally intended I would try and deliver as a piece to camera, but it just doesn't work for me, especially not in a video format where I'm trying to talk about my ideas. I want there to be verbal glitches. I want there to be moments where I appear unsure of myself, because that is an important signpost in how you understand my perspective. And this is my perspective on the core doctrines of Master Mo as I see them. Once again, my perspective is far from sacrosanct. It is not meant to be philosophically rigorous, and it does not claim scholarly expertise. And once again, I please invite any opinions from anyone, whether you have expertise or not. But like I say, this is my view on the core doctrines of Master Mo. In saying this, I do not claim that this is all there is to Moism, and certainly another section of the book of Master Mo is a very interesting set of just single-line aphorisms which seem to kind of highlight individual philosophical concepts. And these are almost trying to create a sort of scientific view of the Moist philosophy, and these were derived by the later Moists coming after the time of Mo himself. These aphorisms are considered some of the most difficult to analyze in all of Eastern philosophy. For one reason, linguistically, because it really matters how you interpret the so-called head character of the aphorism and then the characters after them. And obviously translating them into English brings in all sorts of problems in that regard. This is important because even though they appear to be defining specific philosophical concepts, definition was exactly not what the Moists, I think, were trying to achieve, at least as I understand it. There's another ancient Chinese school, the school of names, which did say, okay, if you name something, then you name it as a thing in itself, and thus you must give that thing in itself an identity by defining it. But for the Moists, that's not what definition was. Definition always had to rely on the interrelationship between the thing and all the other things which were pertinent to it. This is an almost Hegelian approach to philosophy, you know, conjuring up this idea of thesis and antithesis, which is probably why these aphorisms are put in a section that was referred to as the dialectics. So yeah, this is an extremely complex and nuanced part of the book of Master Mo. I do not propose to go into it, but if you are interested in a primer on Moism, including the dialectics, then I recommend the article on the online Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which goes into some depth. But to start coming back to the core doctrines, the Book of Mo and Confucianism and, you know, what else I've read of ancient Chinese philosophy, it does put me in mind of ancient Western philosophy. Not because there's any kind of connection between them, but simply that this is how introspective people at that time would approach precisely those deep questions that we still have not entirely resolved. You know, there is still the trope of, you know, all of Western philosophy being footnotes to Plato. Obviously that is inaccurate, but many of the problems that Plato put his finger on, we still have not entirely resolved. You know, the problem of political violence is just one. There has been no resolution to that, ultimately. There is a lot of nuance, and it's very important nuance that we need to be aware of as society has become more complex. But the basic idea of how political authority functions still has this essential dichotomy within it. And the same is true in the Eastern traditions. Confucianism and other traditions like legalism ultimately won out in the East, and Chinese tradition has remained more committed to enshrining, you know, the way that Confucian principles worked. This has been for better and for worse, I think, ultimately. But some of that has still come from Moism, you know, the ideas of filial piety and this authoritarian streak of an established natural hierarchy and this trickle-down virtue that brings order to society. This is very much present in Moism and is very much present in Confucianism. So, there is a lot of parity between the two. That being said, Mo was a strong opponent of the Confucians for a number of reasons. Some versions of the story cast him as a student of Confucianism, who moved away. He went his own way, and he abandoned the teachings. And remember that Confucius, the man, is only one proponent of the school of learning which now bears his name. He was not the originator of Confucianism. He was just one proponent of that philosophical construct. Moism, excuse me. Thank you. Okay. Master Mo actually saw Confucians as lazy, hypocritical, and manipulative. He saw them as taking advantage of problems within a state to benefit themselves materially in many ways. Now, I think some of this could come from Master Mo's being very much an ascetic himself, and so maybe, he took that asceticism, as I've suggested before, a little bit too far, carrying it through to his general philosophy in ways which made it fairly clear that Moism was never going to be taken on board as the widest political system, simply because it was disagreeable to many people on a basic level. They don't feel like they want to live in the principles that Mo is laying out, this sort of ascetic level of principles. But in spite of all this, I do think that the parallels between Moism and Confucianism are striking. Overall, though, I think I fundamentally agree with the early chapters of Mo's core doctrines. There doesn't seem anything controversial in the ideas of exalting worthiness, exalting unity, although that does not mean exalting homogeneity in a group, condemning offensive warfare, and espousing moderation in use. All of these things seem to be extremely beneficial to harmony within a state, as far as I can see it. And I also agree, as I said, with the final chapter of condemning fate, being against fate, although I do have trouble internalizing this idea in my everyday life. And I think that is a universal problem with humanity. We all experience the inertia that comes from feeling like we are powerless to some extent. And it is often the source of greatest dissatisfaction that we have with ourselves and with the world in general. And there is a strong urge, I think, in viewing ourselves as the hero in our own story, to externalize that dissatisfaction and thus create a judgment relationship between us and some other part of the world system within which we all exist. And therefore, you might say that the inertia of fate could be one of the most tragic forces in the whole of human history for that reason. On the other hand, I think that heaven's intention, the idea of ghosts and spirits, and condemning music all seem fundamentally flawed ideas to me. I think I understand what they are intended to achieve. I also think I see that the arguments within them would be much more plausible in Mo's time, a lower tech civilization. Specifically, the condemnation of music, I think, is just a neurosis on the part of Mo. I don't see how you can ever think that just the very idea of music at all is harmful. I do see how an excessive attachment to music and the elaborate instruments and the, lifting up of dancers and having them be, given all of the best food and taking away materials from the state, I do see how that can be harmful. But for that, we only need to go back to Mo's doctrine of moderation in use to alleviate that harm. We do not need to condemn music out of hand. And I'm really not sure why Mo goes to that extreme. However, when it comes to heaven and ghosts, I really don't think that Mo is entirely drinking his own Kool-Aid. I said this when we were talking about ghosts and spirits, but I think it applies to heaven's intention as well. Mo is quite subtle in his language, but he really does take the view, like Plato did, in a way that it doesn't matter if ghosts and spirits don't exist. Everyone should act as if they do. I think that he's more subtle than Plato in that Plato thought that this only needed to apply to the masses, and that the philosopher kings in their ivory tower could sort of accept that really this was just a way of keeping, people acting in the way as to promote benefit. But no, for Mo, I really think he does think that everyone in society, up to and including the Son of Heaven, should act on this belief that ghosts and spirits are real. But this only seems to me to demonstrate the tragic failure of the idea, because ultimately, as society becomes more complex, and of course Mo never lived to see this, but it only that belief becomes more and more attenuated and harder to uphold, where surely it would be much better to take something like the doctrine of universal love and mutual benefit and make it a real grounded basis for society that does not require the use of ghosts and spirits in order to, keep it moving forward and keep it functioning for the benefit of society. And let me pause to forestall any claims of scientific arrogance here. It's easy to say, well, how can you write off ghosts and spirits? This is this rationalist worldview which claims that science knows everything. No, it's not. But we can say, I think uncontroversially, that many things that we used to know are now known to be false. And this will continue into the future. And that's not just in a science will continue to refine itself through time kind of a way, although it will, but it is genuinely in a kind of we could be completely fucking mistaken about the whole nature of reality kind of way. And that does not make me uncomfortable. But here, living in the now, and interacting with the modern world, which we all interact with if you're watching this video at all, we have to accept that ghosts, spirits, and the idea of heaven cannot be said to be quantifiably real in the four-dimensional space-time that we appear to inhabit. Now, as we continue to investigate this world, they could become more real or less real as we continue to learn more about the nature of space-time, and that will remain to be seen. But from where we are now, that is what we have to say. And so that is why I cannot really support much of what was said in Mo's chapters on heaven's intention or on ghosts and spirits. But the most interesting of all, the one that I haven't mentioned yet, is of course the doctrine of universal love and exchange of mutual benefit. And it's interesting because it really does engender, the golden rule of morality. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And this was historically, if we take the chronological history, it was first suggested, I think, by Confucius, or the Confucian school, should we say. But Mo obviously takes it on board as his very central premise. And in doing so, it puts me in mind of another philosopher from the Western tradition who I have referred to already in the course of these videos, and that is Jesus of Nazareth. So just as the ancient philosophers sought to make their systems something intuitive that all of society could accept, I think that Mo and Jesus wanted to do the same with the doctrine of universal love. And unfortunately, I think both also understood that this is something that human nature, whatever that is, doesn't seem to back up. That human nature prevents the doctrine of universal love from persisting through time. For reasons we might go into. So this is why both ultimately fell back on a spiritual justification for the doctrine. Now for me, I think that in the modern mass society, more people having more time, being given more time really, to be more introspective and think more deeply about some of these issues would allow something like the doctrine of universal love to become more of a rational principle in the way that we organize society. Am I wrong about this? Maybe. There are certainly many who would think I am wrong, but I think I know why they would say I am wrong. Because the doctrine of universal love kind of feels sucky sometimes. And it requires two things that we need to get over in order to apply it. It requires that we step outside of our everyday selfishness, our basic everyday selfishness. And it requires, and this is where Mo and Jesus had to sort of crowbar their philosophies a little bit, it requires that we accept that we're just doing it because it's the right thing to do. It requires that we sort of, on some level, understand that there is no arbitration of the doctrine, that we're just doing it because that is the way that we should behave. Mo and Jesus seem to kind of address the second point with this stoic asceticism that they both kind of had. But they never really resolved the first point. Both of them at this point fell back into their sort of spiritual claims, whether that be their claims of divinity in the case of Jesus or the belief in heaven and ghosts in the case of Mo. But in my view, Mo does make the better attempt at a justification. Jesus, at least as he's represented in the Bible, does kind of ultimately justify his idea of universal love with his claims of divinity. No one reaches the Father except through me. It is easier for a rich man to pass through the eye of a needle. It's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get in access to the kingdom of heaven. All of this is explicitly appealing to this idea of heaven. Mo and his utilitarian rhetoric does also claim that, objectively, the doctrine of universal love will make society better, and it will allow this other idea of trickle-down virtue to function, as long as you presuppose that the Son of Heaven and all of his officers are genuinely virtuous, which is a big assumption. But no, at least that attempt is there. Ultimately, though, Mo's justification, just like Jesus's, falls back on a phantasm, on the idea of ghosts and spirits and of heaven above. And so we are still left, in effect, skydiving into the future if we don't accept that ghosts and spirits and heaven are really there. But what is it? What is it that makes human nature incompatible with the doctrine of universal love? And for me, the answer is simple, and Mo had it. It's fatalism. It's the idea that wherever you are in your life, whatever your priorities at this time, whatever you want to do, whatever you think you can do, whatever you think you might never be able to do, it is all constrained by inertia, by ideological inertia. And it is not possible for you to entirely step out of that worldview. And so it is not possible for you to truly put the doctrine of universal love and understanding into effect. It is not possible for you to truly love thy neighbor as thyself. It is not possible for you to truly see another state as you would your own state. And that is the tragedy of human politics in many ways. But like I say, we are able to see this trap now. We are aware of the existence of this ideological pitfall. And if only more people could be given the opportunity to spend time expounding it in their own way and with their own purpose, I feel we could start to make movements in the direction of the doctrine of universal love. But who knows? I could be wrong. I'm going to wrap up now, but suffice to say, I think that Moism is a very interesting set of doctrines, and particularly the doctrine of universal love and shared mutual benefit. And perhaps the most interesting thing about it is the fact that we've been completely unable to put it into enduring practice in any human political system throughout history, whether that be in the East or the West. If you're in the West and you want to try and say, wait a minute, Jesus is still a very central figure in Christian doctrines to this day. Trivially so. Come on. I mean, even the everyday Christian who wears a "What would Jesus do" band on their arm, they probably don't really treat their neighbor as they treat themselves. They certainly don't treat another family as they treat their own family. And 100%, none of them treat another state as they view their own state. In fact, it's almost antithetical to any of the ostensibly Christian creeds in the West to this day. But quite aside from that, even if you want to claim that Jesus remains an important moral figure in Christianity, he certainly has precisely nothing to do with the application of monotheistic political power in the Western tradition, which has basically been from the death of the Roman Empire through to now. All of the monotheistic political traditions, and I say monotheistic because it applies through Judaism to Christianity and to Islam, they all completely ignore any of the premises of their creed which suggest that, hey, maybe it would be nice if all different groups of people in the world could be nicer to each other. All of them have these principles, and yet none of them weave it into their inherent sense of the political power structure. Why is this? I could go on at length, but I won't. All that's left for me to say is I hope you've enjoyed this little look at Mohism. If you have any comments on it, please put them down below. I'd love to read them. But thank you very much for watching, and bye for now.